February 2026, Vladimir Putin just handed his generals a promotion for conquering the ruins of Pokrovsk. From the Kremlin's gilded halls, it looks like a triumph, the logistics heart of the Donbas finally under Russian boots. But behind the propaganda, there is a sickening reality that the Russian public isn't allowed to see. To take this one town, a town that was effectively neutralized as a supply hub 6 months ago, Putin has liquidated over 100,000 of his own men. That's not a victory, that is a demographic death sentence. While the Russian army was busy drowning in its own blood for a few square miles of scorched earth, Ukraine's top brass was smiling. Why? Because they didn't lose Pokrovsk, they spent it. They traded a pile of rubble for the total exhaustion of Russia's last effective offensive reserves. And now, as the frost begins to thaw, the trap is finally snapping shut. If you are tired of the sanitized headlines and you want the brutal, unfiltered truth about the war that's redrawing the map of the world, you're in the right place. This is Hardpoint Military. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. We don't just report on the front lines, we expose the strategic rot that's turning the second army in the world into a memory. Sub up, because the real story is just getting started. To understand why Putin was willing to throw a generation of young Russian men into the furnace for this one city, you have to look at the map. Pokrovsk wasn't just another town on the steppe, it was the beating heart of the Ukrainian defense. Before the invasion, Pokrovsk was the junction where the main rail lines and highways met. It was the gateway to the west, the primary staging ground for every shell, every medical kit, and every soldier moving into the Donetsk sector. Putin's generals believed that if they cut this artery, the entire Ukrainian Eastern Front would bleed out in weeks. By mid-2025, the Russian Ministry of Defense had moved a staggering 220,000 troops to this axis, outnumbering the defenders by more than 5 to 1. They deployed their elite remnants, the 90th Tank Division and the 15th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade. This was a maximum effort campaign. But while Russia was obsessing over the logistics of Pokrovsk, they missed the bigger picture. But here's the twist. Ukraine knew Pokrovsk was vulnerable. Instead of turning it into a meat grinder for their own troops, they used it as a breakwater. They spent the last 18 months turning the cities behind it, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka, into what military analysts call the fortress belt. These cities aren't just fortified, they sit on the higher ground. While Russian tanks were struggling through the Donbas mud at a pathetic 16 yards per day, Ukrainian engineers were pouring concrete on the heights above. Putin thought he was capturing a prize. In reality, he was paying 100,000 lives to move his army into a low-ground kill zone, directly beneath the barrels of Ukraine's most advanced artillery. The assault began not with a whimper, but with the roar of Soviet-era turbofans reborn for a new age of vengeance. To crack the Pokrovsk nut, Russia unleashed the 90th Tank Division, their heavy hitters, expecting a repeat of Avdiivka. They pushed hundreds of T-90Ms and BMP-3s into the narrow corridors of the Donbas, but they were driving straight into a digital kill zone. While Russian artillery was busy leveling residential blocks, Ukraine debuted its most terrifying indigenous weapon to date, the FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile. But here's the twist.
This isn't your grandfather's cruise missile. Developed by Firepoint, a startup of game designers and architects, the Flamingo is a flying bomb, optimized for one thing: industrial-scale destruction. It carries a massive 1,150-kilogram warhead that's 2.5 times the punch of a U.S. Tomahawk. Imagine a ton of high explosives, repurposed from aerial bombs, traveling at 900 kilometers per hour.
In the opening salvos, Ukraine didn't just hit the front lines. They used the Flamingo's staggering 3,000-kilometer range to bypass Russia's frontline air defenses entirely. While the 15th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade was preparing to storm the southern districts of Pokrovsk, Flamingos were screaming overhead, obliterating the Kapustin Yard test range and FSB bases in Crimea. On the ground, the horror for the Russian meat waves was absolute. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, backed by the 7th Rapid Response Corps, utilized a swarm and fade tactic. They allowed Russian infantry to enter the gray zones of the city, only to collapse the buildings on top of them using pre-sighted FPV drone strikes. By the end of the first week of the main assault, the carnage was so dense that Ukrainian commanders reported a 15-to-1 casualty ratio. For every Ukrainian defender who fell, 15 Russians were left in the mud. Putin's blitzkrieg had officially transformed into a 100,000-man graveyard. While the Kremlin was busy burning through its 20th final reserve of Soviet-era shells, the West was quietly handing Ukraine the keys to a different kind of war. This wasn't just about hardware, it was about the invisible front. In late 2025, NATO transitioned from donation mode to integration mode. We aren't just talking about tanks anymore. We're talking about NSATU, the NATO Security Assistance and Training Facility, which by early 2026 had turned the Ukrainian General Staff into the most data-rich command center in history. But here's the twist. The world watched as Russia tried to hijack Starlink terminals to extend their drone ranges. It was a desperate move, but in February 2026, the hammer dropped. Working with SpaceX, Western intelligence executed a surgical connectivity blackout. In a single 48-hour window, Russian drone effectiveness plummeted by a staggering 40%. Russian pilots were suddenly flying blind, their multi-million-dollar reconnaissance drones turning into expensive bricks over the Donbas mud. And while the U.S. political machine was locked in a deep freeze, Europe stepped up with a vengeance. Germany's massive $11.5 billion package, the largest in its history, delivered the iron umbrella of IRIS-T and Patriot systems that made the Pokrovsk pocket a no-fly zone for Russian jets. But the real supporting player wasn't a country, it was a financial death warrant. While Putin bartered for North Korean shells, a coalition of the willing led by Britain and France began leveraging frozen Russian assets to bankroll the serial production of the Flamingo. The West isn't just sending weapons anymore. They are funding the factories that are building Putin's nightmare right on his doorstep. Russia is fighting a 20th century war of attrition. Ukraine's allies just gave them a 21st century unlimited credit line. By February 2026, Pokrovsk had become a manpower graveyard. To hold its ruins, the Kremlin stripped the Zaporizhzhia front of its last reserves. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, struck fast. The weakened 58th Combined Arms Army collapsed as Ukrainian forces retook 8 settlements in days. Russia had already burned its best armor in the Donbas. Then the real blow. Russian electronic warfare failed. Drone swarms and a Starlink blackout left field commanders blind. No artillery, no coordination, no warning.
By March 2026, Russia was losing 35,000 troops a month and recruiting only 30,000. The math had turned lethal. What did Putin buy with his grand victory in Pokrovsk? A front-row seat to Russia's decline. By March 2026, Moscow had traded the core of its modern military for just 1.4% of Ukraine's territory at staggering economic cost. While the flag flies over ruins, the economy strains under 21% interest rates and a shrinking workforce. But the deeper damage is structural. A full war economy has taken hold, factories pivoted to shells, inflation devouring wages, over 1 million dead or wounded draining the country's future. Recovery, by some estimates, could take decades. For Ukraine, the fall of Pokrovsk became a calculated sacrifice. By grinding down Russia's elite units in the Donbas, Kyiv set the conditions for a southern counteroffensive in 2026. The fortress lines held, and for the first time since the invasion began, Russia isn't advancing, it's eroding. What looked like a breakthrough now resembles something else. Not stalemate, but slow collapse.
The Pokrovsk Trap wasn't just a battle. It was a revelation. In modern war, mass and brutality can't outmatch precision, intelligence, and a nation that refuses to break. Putin's victory is a hollow shell, costly, symbolic, and strategically corrosive. If you want clear-eyed analysis of the tactics, tech, and hard numbers shaping this war, hit subscribe and join the Hardpoint military community. We go beyond headlines and into the data. Drop a comment below. Was the Zaporizhzhia bounce back a turning point, or can the Kremlin absorb another year of losses? Let's take it to the war room.